with all the mix of emotions that comes with that, the sadness and the grief, but also the joy, and you're not quite sure what to do with it. Peter knew about that. On that day, when he went out to the lake shore, he knew about that. Because, on Good Friday, well, Maundy, Thursday, and Good Friday, as he had the last meal with Jesus, and Jesus was taken away, he had abandoned him. He denied him not once, not twice, but 3 times. And when Jesus needed him most, not only did he fall asleep on him in the Garden of Gethsemane, but he was nowhere to be found as Jesus hung on that cross and died. Friday was horrible. But Saturday had to have been even worse, because on Saturday he had to have realized the reality of what was happening. The enormity of what he had done in abandoning Jesus. The reality that Jesus was dead. But then came Sunday. And on Sunday, the tomb was empty. Jesus had risen, and there was nothing that could stop him. Not a tomb, not a closed door, not even death could stop Jesus. He was alive. And nothing would ever be the same because of that. And so what do you do when you're dealing with all those emotions of having had the worst thing that could ever happen, and the very best thing that could ever happen? Well, if you're Peter, you go fishing. Now, before we get to that story that we're already talking about with the children, about that beautiful breakfast on the lake shore, I want to share something that I think's a little bit interesting, because that story comes in John, the 21st chapter. But at the end of John, the 20th chapter, John says this. Then Jesus did many other miraculous signs in his disciples' presence, signs that aren't recorded in this scroll. But these things are written so that you will believe that Jesus is the Christ, God's Son, and that believing you will have life in his name. Now, I don't know about y'all, but that sounds like the end to me, right? But it isn't the end. John's going to go on for a whole other chapter to tell us more stuff. And it's sort of like if you've been to one of those movies, where you get to the end and then the credits roll, and then there's one more scene that adds to the plot. Or you're on the phone with a friend, and you're about to hang up, and your friend goes, "Oh, one more thing I forgot to tell you." And you're on the phone for a good while longer. Or that moment in which the preacher says, "In conclusion," and then goes on for another 20 minutes. I'm sure that Don never does that, but there is sort of like a preacher's rule of thumb, which is, once you've made your point, you need to land that sucker and let God's people go. But John didn't do any of that, okay? John had more to say. And here's why I think John had more to say. Because if he had stopped right there, yes, Jesus had risen. Yes, lots of signs were done and lots of miracles occur. But if the story ended there, he would have left the disciples locked up in the upper room. And there was a whole lot more to the story for them and for us. So I'm going to be reading from John, the 21st chapter, beginning in verses 1 and going through 19. Hear the word of the Lord. Later, Jesus himself appeared again to his disciples at the Sea of Tiberias, and this is how it happened. Simon Peter, Thomas called Didymus, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, Zebedee's sons, and 2 other disciples were together. And Simon Peter told them, "I'm going fishing." And they said, "We'll go with you." And they set out in a boat, but throughout the night they caught nothing. And early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples didn't realize it was Jesus. And Jesus called to them, "Children, have you caught anything to eat?" And they answered him, "No." And he said, "Cast your net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some." And so they did. And there were so many fish that they couldn't haul in the net. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." And when Simon Peter heard it was the Lord, he wrapped his coat around himself, for he was naked, and jumped into the water. And the other disciples followed in the boat, dragging the net full of fish, for they weren't far from shore, only about 100 yards. And when they landed, they saw a fire there with fish on it and some bread. And Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish that you've just caught." And Simon Peter got up and pulled the net to shore. It was full of large fish, 153 of them. Yet the net hadn't torn, even with so many fish. And Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." And none of the disciples could bring themselves to ask him, "Who are you?" They knew it was the Lord. And Jesus came, took the bread, and gave it to them. And he did the same with the fish. Now, this was the third time that Jesus appeared to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. And when they finished eating, Jesus asked Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" And Simon replied, "Yes, Lord, you know I love you." And Jesus said to him, "Feed my lambs." Jesus asked a second time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And Simon replied, "Yes, Lord, you know I love you." And Jesus said to him, "Take care of my sheep." He asked a third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And Peter was sad that Jesus asked him a third time, "Do you love me?" And he replied, "Lord, you know everything. You know I love you." And Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep." I assure you that when you were younger, you tied your own belt and walked around wherever you wanted. And when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands and another will tie your belt and lead you where you don't want to go. He said this to show the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. And after this, Jesus said to Peter, "Follow me." This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. So what do you do when you're dealing with that mix of emotions of the worst thing that could ever happen and the best thing that can ever happen? If you're Peter, you go fishing. Now, we need to be clear here. This is not the Andy Griffith, get your fishing pole and wander down to the lake kind of fishing. Fishing for Peter was not a hobby. It was work. So when Peter said to his friends, to the sons of Zebedee and all of them, "Let's go fishing," he wasn't saying, "Let's go relax." He was saying, "Let's get back to work." He was saying, "Let's go to the office. Let's go to the school. Let's go to the bank. Let's go to the factory." He was saying, "Let's go back to what we were doing before Jesus interrupted everything." And so they find themselves back where they started. Now, it'd be real easy to judge them for that. Except if we're really honest, we know that it's really easy to do that, isn't it? Really easy to come into worship on Sunday morning and sing God's praises and walk out the door and doubt. Really easy to come in and say the words of the creed and walk out and treat people as if we have never experienced the love and grace of Jesus Christ. When they get cut across in front of us in traffic, or that annoying coworker, or our spouse, or our children, or that person that we gossip about, all these wonderful things we've said about Jesus, and we walk out and we do them yet again. Really easy to say when we are baptized that we're Christian, and then walk out the door, go to our homes, go to our workplaces, and act just like everyone else. It is so easy to go back to where we were before. But that's why I love Peter. Peter is my favorite disciple. Because I figure if God can use him, he can use me as well. Because Peter really struggled to live out a life as a disciple. And he made so many mistakes. And yet, God used him again and again. It was Paul that said that he knew the things that he ought to do, but he did not do the things that he ought to do. But Peter is the one that we have the stories of him doing that again and again and again. And yet in the end, what Peter seems to know in the depth of his heart at some level is that no matter what, he will be forgiven. So they're out there on the boat. And they're fishing. They hadn't had much luck. And there's somebody on the shore hollering at them that at first they don't recognize. And the disciple that Jesus loved, who seems to always be a little quicker on the uptake than Peter, says, "It's the Lord." And then the strangest thing happens. I don't know if you noticed it when I was reading the scripture, but it says that Peter was naked. Now, scholars will tell us that fishermen of those days wore layers. It's kind of like in the South, in the spring when we're not sure if it's going to be cold or if it's going to be really, really hot by the end of the day, and we wear lots of layers. And so they would have layers so they could put on more if they got cold or if they take it off if they got hot. And so scholars say that perhaps we should translate that as lightly clothed rather than naked. But whether he was naked or lightly clothed, what happens next is really strange. Because then he puts on more clothes and jumps in the water. Now, I've seen a lot of people jump in the water, but I've never seen them put on more clothes before they do it. And here's what I think is going on. Because remember, this is the Gospel of John, and John likes to use images, he likes to use words, he likes to use phrases that make us think back to other stories in the Bible, particularly back to the Old Testament. And I think John wants us to think about another naked man. And y'all know that story. It's in the beginning in Genesis. When God creates the heavens and the earth and all that's in it, and he creates Adam and Eve in his own image, and he puts them in the middle of the garden, and he says, this is very, very good. And it says, and they were naked and unafraid. And they are. Everything's great. Until they eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And then suddenly they realize that they don't have clothing. Suddenly they realize they're vulnerable. And so they grab fig leaves, scratchy fig leaves, and try to cover themselves up. And I think that part of what's happening to Peter in that moment, when he's on that boat and he realizes that is Jesus, is what happens to many of us when we come to face with the risen Christ. He realized his sin. He realized his vulnerability. And he covered up to hide all of that. But here's where the stories get kind of different. Because in the story with Adam and Eve, if you remember, they put on the fig leaves and they do what? They go and hide. And God comes looking for them. But what Peter does is very different. He puts on the clothing and he jumps in the water and he swims to Jesus. And you see, I think that truly is one of the beautiful things about Peter is he knew that no matter what, Jesus would forgive him. In fact, I often think that the biggest difference between what Peter did on those final days of Christ's life and what Judas did is that Peter was willing to accept forgiveness and Judas never could. And so he puts on that clothes, he jumps in the water, he swims across, and Jesus feeds him. Beautiful breakfast on the lake. Probably the best fish and bread he's ever had in his life. And it's a wonderful moment. And probably about the time he's starting to relax and feel pretty good about this, Jesus says to him, Simon, son of John. Now, I think if we want to get a sense of how Peter felt at that moment, think back to your childhood. Now, this is how it worked at my family, okay? So if my mom said Cheryl, everything's fine, okay? If it was Cheryl Ann, it was a little dicey. And if I became Cheryl Ann Sisler, I was in big trouble. And your heart would drop into your stomach. And here is Peter walking with Jesus, the one who changed his name from Simon to Peter, and he hears, Simon, son of John. You know how he must have felt. And then Jesus says to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? And Peter says, yes, Lord, you know I do. And he says, feed my lambs. He turns to him a second time and he says, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And Peter says, Lord, you know I do. And he says, tend my sheep. And then he turns to him a third time And it says that Peter gets very sad when he says, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Although Peter should not have been surprised since he denied Jesus 3 times that he would be asked this question 3 times. And so Peter says to him, Lord, you know everything. You know I love you. And he says, feed my sheep. And in that moment, Peter was forgiven and he was recommissioned to be a follower of Jesus Christ and to go out and to care for those that God so loved. There's tremendous good news in all of this for us, y'all. There's good news in knowing that in the midst of our everyday lives that Jesus will come and find us. That no matter how we deny him, no matter how we may hurt him, that he will accept us and forgive us. That no matter how broken we are, that he will call us, that salvation and grace is a free gift that is given to us, not because we are good, but because God is good. And that is tremendous. But there's more to it than that because the story goes on. And I actually love that it ends with the simple, follow me. Follow me. Because here's the thing. When we experience the love and grace of Jesus Christ, then we will begin to see the world the way that Jesus sees the world. Our heart will break for the things that break Jesus' heart. We will want to give ourselves for others in the same way that Christ gave himself for us. And if we don't, we remain locked up in that upper room. But when we really experience the love and grace of Jesus Christ, we find out that we are not truly free. We don't truly experience the joy that we can until we, in fact, give it away to the rest of the world. And so, he calls us to go and to love the world like he so loves. To feed the lambs, to tend the sheep, to feed the sheep, to love the world. To love the world the way Christ loves. And it's then, and only then, that we become true followers of Jesus Christ and that we truly experience the joy and the salvation and the life that he expects for us. Now, I know that we Christians often have an awful lot of excuses as to why we're too busy or we don't have the right gifts to be out in the world doing the things that Jesus did. But I think it's really important because it's usually not enough. I don't have enough time, I don't have enough gifts, I don't have enough money, I don't have enough this. But one of the things you'll notice is that Jesus didn't spend a whole lot of time with people that had a lot of stuff. He didn't spend a lot of time with people that had it all together. In fact, he used the people that most people would not expect to be used. Sinners, prostitutes, tax collectors, and those people that were on the margins, broken people, because to reach broken people, you need broken people. And because it's really not about us, it's about Christ. And he works through them to share the good news that there's healing, that there's forgiveness, and there's new life to be found. So today we've gathered to sing God's praises, to affirm our faith in Christians throughout the world with a creed, to sing a doxology of how wonderful God is, to bring our gifts. But if we walk out this door and it does not change how we live our lives and how we treat others, then we're just staying locked up in another room. Because we're called to follow Christ into the world that he loves so much, he gave his life for it. We're called to go out and share that good news. Because outside the walls of this church are people who are broken and need healing. Are people who have sinned and need forgiveness. are people who need a word of hope and a word of grace, and people who need a word of challenge, people who need a cup of cold water in Christ's name, people who need to be fed, people who need to know that they are loved and accepted, and there's a future in this life for them. And we as his people, we as his disciples, are called to follow him out into that world and share that good news. So as we prepare to wind down today, sing our final hymn and pray our final prayers and walk out the door, we need to remember what this is really all about, which is following Jesus out to the world he loves. And the question I leave with you is the question that Jesus asked Peter. Jesus said, "Do you love me? If you love me, then you'll feed my lambs. Do you love me? If you love me, then you'll tend my sheep. If you love me, then you'll feed my sheep. You'll follow me out to the world that I so love." Let us pray. Dear Lord, we are so grateful that in the midst of our ordinary daily lives, you come to us, called to us, and accepted us, and forgave us. And we ask, Lord, that in this moment, that we will truly accept what you've done for us. Lord, I suspect there are people that are here today that still are trying to cover themselves up, afraid that you won't accept them as they are. That if you really know, and you do really know who they are, that you might not forgive them, and you are telling them, come to me, and you will forgive them. Lord, there are those of us who have hardened our heart to the world that you so love, out of fear or anger or hurt. And we ask, Lord, that you soften our heart, that you open our eyes and our ears to hear and see the world as you hear and see. And so fill us with your Spirit that we will, in fact, go out and serve you. We thank you, Lord, for your love and grace, your willingness to give yourself for us. And we pray, Lord, that you will enable us to give ourselves for others. We pray all these things in the name of your Son. Amen. And can I tell you a story? I'm not going to keep you late. A little story, and I may have told this before. The final hymn is